I still don't have one of those caps. I shipped a conference, man. Come on.
Well, you gotta ship. You didn't ship it in September. This is the September cap.
That's like details, right? Right? Well, talking about shipping apps, I think we'll have a great talk on that topic later in the conference. But one of the things you need to do when creating an app is making sure that you maybe can monetize it, right? Is something Revenue Cat can help you do?
Yeah, that's kind of our bread and butter.
And Charlie is actually monetizing something himself. So he creates an awesome little product called Dark Noise. If you need something that produces white noise or like a nice seashore style background noise, if it helps you sleep, check out Dark Noise because it's an awesome little app and I really like it. Do we need to say anything more about you?
I mean, you can keep going.
Oh, okay, so I'll just do his
I'll
content.
always take
So
more
Revenue
praise.
Cat, they have this paywall feature.
You can do the whole thing.
So definitely check it out once he has done his talk. Come talk to Josh and to Charlie because I think Revenue Cat is one of those API providers that really helps you out with the product. It's easy to integrate and it does a lot for you. And I think that's what we can all use as software developers. Something that actually saves you time and helps you monetize your product. So without any further delays by me and bad jokes, I don't have any dad jokes yet this conference. Here's Charlie. And I still don't have a cap.
Alright, message received. Alright, so I'm going to talk about building dynamic paywalls using backend driven development. Before the word paywalls makes your eyes glaze over and kind of tune out, I'm using paywalls as the framing device, but it's really kind of more about the backend driven development thing, which I think can apply, throughout your app in different ways. So hopefully there's some things in here that are helpful for everybody. So let's start with who I am. So I am a developer advocate at Revenue Cat. This is why I'm dressed head to toe, literally toe. I'm wearing the socks with Revenue Cat swag. I started that this year, so it's kind of a newer thing for me. But yeah, so that's what I do as my day job. But I'm also, as Jeroen said, an indie developer. I make an app called Dark Noise, which is a white noise app. Recently switched that to subscriptions. So now I have an example in my indie world of having a paywall as well. And then I also have a podcast called Launched. I think there's multiple past guests and some future guests here in the audience that will be on that. But it's basically like an interview show where I talk to mostly indie iOS developers about building and launching things into the world. This is also my first well, not technically, but it's basically my first conference talk. I was actually talking with some people last night and remembered that I have given a tech talk before, but it was, I have a picture of it here. It was in 2013 and it was about Windows 8. There were approximately, I think, 8 people in the audience, which I believe was every Windows developer that existed. So it's been a little while since I've done it. I've never really done it with a big crowd, so apologies for any nerves. All I ask from you all is to be engaged, laugh at every single one of my jokes, and if you don't mind, maybe give me like a standing ovation at the end or something small like that. All right, so let's get into the actual talk here. So I like to start these out, because I have so much experience, with identifying a problem, because what's the point in talking about anything if there's not a problem to solve? So most of us here are web developers, or sorry, not web developers, are mobile developers, and there's some things that we don't get to do that web developers do. There's some advantages to being on the web. Big one is you don't have to wait for app review. All of us have been there. Maybe from the developer side, it's kind of an advantage because we can just tell people, no, we can't do that because of app review. We have an excuse. But from a product perspective, this can be a problem because sometimes you just need things out there. Because you have to wait on app review, you can't update your UI instantly. Web developers can literally have a product person ask them to do something, they can push that change out into production and everybody has it immediately. And this, importantly, if you work at a larger company, makes it so much easier to do A/B testing. And from a product perspective, this can be a really big deal. If you're trying to drive users to take certain behaviors, foreshadowing, if you do paywalls, this is very important because there's a specific user behavior that directly attributes to the money that your company makes. So this is where something that I call backend-driven UI, you'll frequently hear it called backend-driven development, kind of comes into play. I like to use the word UI just because I think as developers, we like the idea of like code and like driving functionality, but really what I'm focusing on here is UI itself and driving that from the backend. So definition of backend-driven UI is driving UI from the backend, which is a really lame explanation. So visually, here's the idea. This is a super familiar concept to literally everybody, so I don't even know why I'm doing this, but we all have cloud services probably that sends data to your front end and you render things based on that data. Usually that's data, so like your app knows how to do a list and you get a whole bunch of like house data if you're a realtor app or something like that, and then you can present it on the screen. But backend-driven UI, the data that you're sending is layout data. So this is like actually driving how your app lays out the UI. That's kind of the concept here. A normal, every single one of our apps is probably just a UI table view, or now it's not UI table view, now it's a Swift UI list. But it's not just taking data, spitting it into a list, but actually like determining how those things look. So if we go back to our advantages of website here, if you're sending layout data now through the backend, now you don't have to wait for app review to make changes. You can instantly update the UI, and then importantly, you can do A/B testing through this way. So before we get into like more specifics here, there's a couple trade-offs here, right? So if you drive everything from the backend, it's gonna obviously be quite a bit more work because it's more complicated. You have to define a contract between your backend teams and your front end teams. And as we all know, you then have to deal with old versions of your app. And this gets really complicated with UI sometimes, especially because it's not just old versions of your app, but old versions of iOS. And so things can get kind of dicey there. And like everything else, anytime you add a layer of architecture into your app, you're creating more code, which is more surface area for bugs. And so in this case, a backend change can completely break your layout, which is obviously a little bit scary. So where does Paywalls come into this? So the main thing here is, I think Paywalls are a great opportunity for using this in a more like simplified way. So when I'm talking about Paywalls, I'm specifically talking about this section right here. So this bottom part, that's like the user interaction area, right? That's where you show the different products. If you have an annual plan or a monthly plan, they can actually click on it and initiate a purchase. But all the stuff above that, that's just marketing content, right? It's kind of dynamic, like people can scroll on it, but there's not a whole lot of user behavior. It's not super complicated. So the reason I think this is a good opportunity for backend-driven UI is that it's a super limited domain. It doesn't need to be highly interactive. And then the big thing is there's a huge advantage to driving this from the backend. So like I said earlier, A/B testing, running experiments on your paywall is one of the most impactful things you can do in your app as far as the business goes, because that directly attributes to how much money your app makes. And then also if you're doing sales, we have Black Friday coming up. Anybody in the like sort of business side of the apps knows that that's coming soon and is probably scrambling to start figuring that out. That's another area where it's really nice to have something that's totally backend driven. You don't have to try and time an app update to a sale that you're going to run. You can just set it all up on the back end and hit save, and then instantly everybody has it. So I want to talk about what I call the gradient of backend-driven UI. So this is, again, I'm kind of pulling out here because if I went into like very specifics, this would be a very boring talk. So I'm just trying to describe conceptually how you should try and think about doing backend-driven UI if you're thinking about doing it. So if we look at an example, this is kind of a standard paywall, right? There's like a picture at the top, you have a list of features, maybe you have a sideways scrolling area that has reviews of your app or something like that. So if you were to try and drive this from your back end, how would you break this down and send it to your app, right? So as developers, probably a lot of us, immediately when we look at this, we break it down into all these different little components. If you're thinking in Swift UI, it's like, okay, this looks like it's a VStack maybe, there's an image up here, there's a title, so those two are center aligned. the features one, that's left aligned, and then you get to those features and you're like, oh, that's like an H stack, and then there's an image over here, and then a V stack next to that, and it starts getting pretty modular. Which, if you were to send all of that information from your backend to be able to render, to completely describe this picture, you're basically looking at HTML. Which you could do, and a lot of people actually do, and then they just run it in a web view, but probably a lot of us here as mobile developers don't really want to do that. It's not a super great experience. And so if you wanted to define this in JSON, you're talking about a really complicated contract that you have to maintain and keep up with your backend team. So that concept sort of lives over here on this gradient. Another way you could break this down is, this is just a thing, right? So this is paywall number 1, and then there could be paywall number 2, and it looks totally different. And then your backend could say render paywall 1 or render paywall 2. Technically, that is your backend sending layout data to your front end, and then that's how it determines how you lay it out. Not very flexible, but incredibly easy contract to maintain, right? Easy code to maintain, that kind of thing. So that lives over here on that gradient. And then maybe something in the middle is, okay, well, let's break it down into just these little boxes. So there's like a header box, and then there's a features box, and a testimonials box, and it's just in one vertical scrolling stack. A lot simpler, a little bit more flexible. You could reorder them, you could take one away, something like that. But it's also a lot more maintainable than totally breaking it down with all these really complicated layout concepts. So these 3 ideas sit on this sort of gradient. And on one side of that gradient is complete flexibility. You can literally do anything. A marketing person could say, I want this paywall that looks this very, very particular way for this sale that I'm running, and they could do something completely crazy. But that's like super, super difficult to maintain. And most of us probably don't work at companies that have big enough teams to maintain something that complicated, right? On the other end, you have really, really simple, you just flip between 2 different completely hard-coded paywalls, easily, like super maintainable, but not flexible at all. So this is kind of like how, like at the beginning of the process of doing this, as developers, at least maybe this is just me, but I tend to get very excited and I just keep moving more and more and more over to the flexibility side because it's a lot more fun, it's exciting, and I'm not thinking about all the pain that that's going to cause later. But in reality, you should be kind of putting your idea on this graph and thinking, where do I really want to sit in terms of cost versus benefits? And so for this talk, I want to focus on this middle one and kind of break down how you could sort of design this. So I call this a feed approach, and I say I call this, it's because at the last company I was at, we did something exactly like this, and we call it a feed. So I'm really just stealing those ideas. So the reason this one I think is a good approach is because it breaks down the UI into something really simple. It's just a set of boxes, we call them modules, that sit on top of each other, and it's endlessly scrolling. It's called a feed because it's like Twitter or Facebook or any of these kinds of feed networks that are usually infinitely scrolling, but in this case, it's a lot more simple than that. And the cool thing is each of these modules are handcrafted native code. You can put videos in here, anything that you can do with SwiftUI or UIKit if you wanted to do that with UIKit, you can do in here. So this isn't talking about like rendering web elements in here that aren't performant. You can just do everything you normally can. And then each one of these blocks has a limited set of inputs. Again, limited being the key word here, because if you're, again, like me, whenever you start building something like this, you keep wanting to add more features. Like, oh, we could make it have different colors and make it have all these different options. But if nobody's using that, that's now just a contract and a bunch of code that you have to maintain and test that isn't actually being used. So I would always recommend keeping it as limited as possible and only adding more features, as you need them. So if we zoom in on one of these, this is the features module. It's actually really, really simple. There's a section header, that's some text that you could send, and then a list of features. And each feature just has 3 things: a name, a description, and an image. In this case, the image is actually a SF symbol, so you can send that along as a string as well. So if we break that down into JSON, it could look something like that, right? That defines this module. And the features section, that's a list. So you can grow that, you can shrink that, all from the back end. But at the end of the day, this is a really simple contract, right? If we go down to testimonials, looks almost exactly the same, right? There's a section header, a list of these testimonials. Each one has a name and a review text. Both of those just strings. So the JSON looks really similar. And then if we scroll up to the header module, pretty similar. It's just a title and an image URL. So both of those can be defined as strings as well. So like we're talking about trying to keep this pretty simple as far as JSON goes, because it gets more complicated as a contract when you're allowing your backend people, and we all know, a marketing team, when they know you have the ability to do something, they're going to push it to its limits every single time. So you want to kind of keep that as simple and limited as you can. So I built one of these, so I'm going to show you really quick kind of how it works. I'm going to try not to get way too in the weeds on the specifics, because I think that's going to be pretty boring, and most of you, you're just going to ask ChatGPT to do it for you when you get to that point anyway. So I have a really, really basic app here, right? It just has a button that can pop open a custom paywall. I'm using RevenueCat, sponsor of this very conference. I'm using RevenueCat for all the paywall stuff, and I'm actually using, RevenueCat has a feature where the way RevenueCat breaks everything down is into things called offerings. So a paywall is an offering, and then you can create 2 offerings, and you can run an A/B test between those 2. And on an offering, you can attach arbitrary metadata, which is just a piece of JSON. I'll show you what that looks like in a minute, but the reason that's important is I'm sending this feed through that JSON object. This could literally be a JSON file sitting on a server somewhere. It doesn't really matter. The reason it's important for paywalls to be through something like RevenueCat is that then you can run A/B tests, which makes it really, really powerful. But yeah, so that's structurally where all this information is coming from. So if we go into the paywall itself, whenever that renders, and it's kind of cool, like our paywalls and everything render in the preview, which is really powerful, especially when you're working on this and tweaking it all the time. So this section down here, you can see, yeah, good deal. This section down here, this is using RevenueCat Paywalls, which is a whole product that we have. Whoops, I just tried to make a purchase in the preview. That's interesting. And that is, literally it's a single line of code here to render that paywall underneath our content. But the focus of this talk is on this paywall marketing feed view. And you can see I'm passing this object called feed modules in there, and that is coming from this call over here to get our offering feed. Again, I'm not going to go into the specifics of how I'm doing this, but the important thing is I'm asking the RevenueCat SDK for our offering, and I get that back as metadata. It's actually a dictionary, but it's essentially JSON. And then I'm decoding that using normal Swift codable into an array of these feed modules. And these feed modules are actually pretty straightforward. Each one has an ID and then a type. And that type is an enum. And each one of these has an associated type that's the actual object itself. And again, I don't have it available yet, but I will put it, Jeroen, I'm guessing there's a way I can distribute links or something after this, but I'll put it somewhere on GitHub so that you can actually look at the code for how I did this. But essentially, everything decodes into these really simple objects that look, if we look at the testimonials object, it's literally just title, list of testimonial structs, which is just name and review text. Again, keeping it as basic and simple as we can. And so where this is all coming from is RevenueCat. Again, sponsor of this show. Not show, conference. Why am I saying show? I guess I watch too much YouTube. So in here we have these things called offerings, and inside of my standard offering right here is this JSON. So let's simplify this a little bit. How much time do I have? Ooh, 2 minutes. Perfect. Not really, I'm gonna go fast. All right, so each one of these is basically just like we described. It's an object that has an ID, a type, and this is where the decodable gets a little complicated because these are generics. But each one has a type, And then inside of that type is a module that has the actual data. So if we go back to our features, so this is a list of the features that are showing. So you can see there's like ad free, here's the SF symbol. And if we go, oh, I didn't actually run this yet. If we run this, so you can see, this is the actual paywall feed that's being rendered. And so I can make any change in here. Like I can completely get rid of the features module because, maybe that's not working well. Or I just want to test, does the features module actually help our app make more money? Or does it hurt? If I want to run a test comparing those two, I can create a duplicate offering of this, delete one of them, and then maybe change this one because Perlock Holmes, he is not trustworthy. So we're gonna get rid of that one. And Fernando Alonso, that's really the one that's been working well for us. So make that one first, and now it's pushed towards the top of the feed. I'm gonna test that out. So if I save that, I don't even need to rerun the app or rebuild the app because this is just live in production. And I run this again, you can see the features thing is completely gone now. Fernando Alonso, the most trustworthy of all reviewers, is the first one on our list. And so, this is a really basic example, but if you've done any A/B testing with this kind of stuff, you know that this is incredibly powerful. A lot of people have found that simply making your paywall longer can have a better conversion because the longer you scroll through this, the more valuable it seems, or the more value that you can show users that they're going to get if they subscribe, right? And so you can just create a whole bunch of these and test different little modules. And while you probably don't want your marketing person, going into a JSON object and manually tweaking things, they can at least ask you to make little tiny changes yourself, or you could build some sort of JSON editor or something for them. But they can kind of do all of that separate from your normal app review development cycle. And so that makes things way faster and way easier to just constantly be running small tests to see if you've made an improvement. So, a couple more considerations. So like we mentioned earlier, support for old app versions is tricky in our world, and it's especially tricky if it's something layout related. So I would recommend in your decoding, be really careful about if you don't recognize a module type, just toss it out. Just don't render it at all. And if you make a new module type that old versions of your app aren't going to work, or sorry, if you're going to update a module type that old versions of your app wouldn't be able to render for whatever reason, give it a brand new name, and then old versions of the app will just ignore it and toss it out. You also can be smart about nil or empty fields. So I can't tell you how many times we had an existing module that we had built for this specific purpose, and this is exactly how marketers intended to use it. And they were like, can we just get rid of that title and scooch this up here? And if you code everything so that if a title is empty, it doesn't leave a blank space for that title, but instead it just actually collapses, now your module can actually look totally different, and it didn't require any coding changes from you. So I would recommend doing something like that. Localization is also something you always need to be thinking about, but if any strings that are coming from your back end are going to be the things that are shown to your users. So you need some sort of mechanism to localize that if your app is localized. If you're using SF symbols or local images, it can be a really good idea to do as opposed to image URLs because they're going to show instantly. But obviously, you have to be really careful about old app versions not recognizing those image types. And then you want to have some kind of test environment for this. So if you're using RevenueCat paywalls for this, or RevenueCat for this, you could create an offering that's just called test offering and make all your changes there and have a test version of your app that's hard-coded to use that offering so you can see it rendered. Because it's always, you can think that you made it to handle every possible situation, but then they're gonna put their header at the bottom of your feed, which is something you never expected, and maybe that causes a layout issue or something. So you always wanna be able to test those things. And then, I'm way over. All right, well, we won't pitch RevenueCat paywalls, but you should use them because they're helpful. Basically, like I was showing you the footer thing at the bottom, you can also have it render full screen, and you can completely control those through our editor, so you don't have to build all this feed thing yourself. You can do something, it's not quite as flexible as what you build yourself, but it's a whole lot easier, and you can A/B test all of those things. All right, these are my links. Go to paywalls.com. Josh wanted me to mention that because that's his favorite URL. That'll just send you to our RevenueCat thing, but we like puns. And yeah, this is all my stuff. This is the part where you cheer loudly for me.
Thank you. So you know the video during your runes talk where the woman kept running into the wall?
Uh-oh. That bad, huh?
That was him running into the end time. And I'll run into it again. So if you'll let Monica set up, please.
Yes.
His links will be on the Telegram. I'm Daniel. Hi, good to see you again. Monica's our next speaker. She's an iOS developer in Macedonia who spent the last 3 years working on AR and is now sort of working on different things and has a lot to tell you.